Before, he was faculty member for 20 years and a professor of archaeology at Tel Aviv University. In 1992, he received his PhD at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and in Tel Aviv University, he served as the head of the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Culture and a vice dean of the Faculty of Humanities. He was the initiator and head of the graduate program in archaeology and archaeomaterials at the Laboratory for Comparative Microarchaeology at Tel Aviv University. In Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, he established a track for archaeomaterials and conservation sciences. His research focuses on early technology and provenance of ceramics, plasters, and metallurgy using mineralogical, structural, and geochemical methods. And what he will talk to us tonight concerning a very important text related to the history of Egypt, i.e. the tablets from Tel el-Amarna, is very interesting because it is trying to put this material in context. Of course, the tablets, the text, which is very known, tell about relations between Egypt and the Near East during the New Kingdom. But when you look at the material, the letters often contain the name of the sender, but not always. Sometimes the letterhead is missing. In other case, we ignore where the sender was staying. And with the difficulties of establishing the location of country and city which are named, we have difficulties to decode the secrets of the Amarna tablets. But tonight, Professor Goren his multidisciplinary approach will give us, first of all, a methodological lesson of how to approach this material and how you can put it in context and how much the material culture can tell us about provenance, relations, and interaction between Egypt and the Levantine. So Professor Goren, is my great pleasure to introduce you, and I give the word from you. And it's nice to have you at a distance. I hope we might be able to meet you in presence once the pandemic crisis is over. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much. And let me first upload my presentation. Okay, and one moment, please. Okay, so I hope that everybody sees. Good evening to everybody. It's really a pleasure to meet you, even if not in the museum where I visited several times. But tonight, this evening, I would like to present a study that for me, it's quite an old study because it is ongoing for over 20 years with like every nice detective story. There are flips and changes and twists in the story, and every time there is a new surprise, and so I would like to share part of it with you. And let me start with some trivia that I'm sure that everybody knows, but I just need to do it for the sake of order. So in general, the arena that we are talking about is so-called the ancient Near East. I prefer to refer to it as West Asia, because it's not merely the Near East, it's not just the Levant, it connects us with Anatolia, Turkey, even the Caucasus on the one side and Egypt on the other side. And our story begins, we can draw the line with Thutmose III, and it begins with the annex of West Asia, namely the Levant up to the Orontes River, and even into North Syria by Thutmose III in the 15th century BC to form the new kingdom of Egypt, the Egyptian empire of the new kingdom. Now, to put a very long story short, it means that Egypt expanded into what the Egyptians called Canaan, and these were just the territories that they captured in the Levant. And of course, while doing that, they clashed or they interacted with the kingdoms and the political superpowers that existed in the area, including first and foremost Mitanni, Hatti at some stage, and of course Assyria and Babylonia. And it appeared that after a long period of clashes and wars, like even the Battle of Kadesh, at some stage everybody was fed up with it, which of course gives us hopes for the present situation in this area. And in a long process of signing peace treaties and alignments, Egypt became allied with these superpowers, which started a long period of peace relations, including commerce, diplomacy, and so on. So this is in general the period that we refer to, and with that, of course, comes the story of the Amarna archive, which again, I'm going just to summarize. El Amarna was a city, a capital city that was established by Amenophes or Amenhotep IV, Akhenaton, also known as Akhenaton, who, due to all kinds of political issues, decided to transfer his capital city into a place that was never inhabited before and establish a new capital in what we call today El Amarna. And this situation existed as long as he was alive, but after his death, very shortly after his death, the capital returned to its original location, and El Amarna was deserted. Now, of course, this story involves, we can see here a picture of the part of the site of El Amarna, and of course it involved this, of course, this correspondence, which gives us a very rare opportunity to learn some details about, for example, the relations between Egypt and the vassal cities, rulers who call themselves kings, known before. So does the international correspondence. Here, for example, I show a tablet that was marked as El Amarna I by Knudson at the beginning of the 20th century. And this is a letter from Egypt to Kadishman Enlil, the king of Babylonia. And of course, I'll talk in a minute about these Egyptian letters. Why do they exist in an Egyptian archive? But of course, the contents of the letter teaches us pretty much about the nature of alliance and international treaties between these superpowers. And of course, this is quite rare because we don't find many evidences like that in the archaeological record. So to make a long story short, our study referred to, of course, all these types, all these kinds or classes of letters, but not only letters. There are other texts as well. And in order to explain what did we do and why was it so interesting for us, let me show some examples. There are, for example, there are international letters, as we see here. Here we see two letters, one coming from a political entity or a kingdom named Alashia, and the other letter, which is written, by the way, in Hittite, is a letter from another political entity called Arzava. And there are letters that sometimes like these that mention the toponyms, the names of the locations from where they were sent, but these locations are not agreed upon for many years. For example, I'll show the case of Alashia in short. Alashia, the location of Alashia is still debated. And so the idea that we can examine not only the text, but also the type of the clay that the tablet, the letter was written on, and assign it to a locality by the same way that we examine pottery in archaeology with geochemical or geophysical or mineralogical methods, and assign them to a provenance. This idea was very tempting, and although it was tested in some cases before, we decided to do it on the large scale to address many questions like that. Now, of course, for us as the inhabitants of the Levant, of Canaan, the other part of the archive was especially interesting. Here we can see letters of the rulers of the city-state of Gezer, which is found in Tel Gezer, now in Israel. And we know the location, it has been excavated. There were also texts found there, but we wanted to know whether it was indeed sent from the city-state of Gezer or not. And of course, so is the case of Jerusalem. Abdi Cheba was a king of Jerusalem, of whom 8 letters are preserved in the archive. And I must admit that I was almost surprised, although I could expect it, to see that the letters were made of exactly the same type of clay that I know from more hundreds of ceramic vessels that I examined from Jerusalem. So it was too good to be true, but that's, of course, the story. And of course, immediately it brings you to the other surprise, and that is finding a letter from Abdi Cheba that was not written on a clay from Jerusalem, but rather from somewhere else. So there are many untold stories that we had to decipher this way. This is, again, a letter of Shuardatu, the king of Gat, or the city-state ruler. He called himself a king, but for the Egyptian pharaoh, he was something like a servant. And again, the tale of Gat later on to become Gat of the Philistines, is well known. It has been excavated for many years, but still it is interesting to check these letters and see if indeed they came from this locality. And if not, why not? Is there something in the text that we can find which will, again, reveal some story that we didn't know so far? Another aspect that was especially interesting for us, and again, it all came into publications, is the scholarly, what is usually referred to as the scholarly texts. The school texts, because in El Amarna, like in any, let's say, big city-state, and of course in an imperial palace, there used to be a school for scribes. And that is because these letters, like many other Near Eastern texts that are found in archives, is written in cuneiform, and cuneiform was the lingua franca of that time. And so, because the Egyptians, of course, were not writing in cuneiform on clay, they were, of course, used to write with ink on papyri. They had to learn, they had to, in a way, reinvent the method and learn how to use cuneiform. And for that, they needed schools for the scribes within the palace. And in these schools, they held also not only exercises made by students, but also the wisdom literature of Mesopotamia, like, for example, this myth that was found in El Amarna, which is a Mesopotamian myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal that, according to our examination, was indeed made in El Amarna because it is made of the Amarna, the Esnamal, and I'll refer to it in a moment. Here we have a text coming from present-day Israel, from the tale of Megiddo, which was actually found by a shepherd herding his sheep and goat on the tell after the excavations made in the 1930s by the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And in the dump, he found this tablet, which is part of the Gilgamesh Tales. And of course, again, it's a Mesopotamian epic that was used probably by the scribes in order not only to study the language, but also the literature of the Mesopotamian world. So this is another aspect that we studied, which ones are local, which ones are not. And this gives us, of course, an interesting story by itself. But of course, within 45 minutes, I won't be able to tell all these stories. And so I'll just pick some examples to show what actually we could come across with or come upon with. So when we study the material of the tablets, of course, it always needs to be a collaboration. I was always collaborating with philologists, sometimes with geographical historians, sometimes they were both. And so it opened the way for many collaborative studies. And now, as part of the Marie Curie ITN, in our consortium, in the ArchMat consortium, the archaeological materials, we have an ESR studying again and developing new methods for the analysis of clay or of documents on clay, including cuneiform tablets. But what do these stories or what does this research tell us? First of all, it tells us about the technology. We always look at tablets as documents, but they were made by some way. There are ceramics, but they are not pottery. There are many differences between just pottery vessels and tablets. And so we studied the technology of how a tablet was formed. Of course, another aspect is the provenance or the provenience, namely where the materials used for the tablet, namely the clay and the temper or whatever, taken from, what is the geological context. And this tells us in many cases about the location where the tablet was written, if indeed it was written in a place from where the clay was taken, which does not come without a question. But of course, this leads us to redraw the map of the geographical history of West Asia in the second millennium BC, because also with the Canaanite city-states, we could support or sometimes even negate assumptions that were made before in terms of the locality of some city-states. This also teaches us, obviously in the case of the school texts, about the nature of the transfer of language and literature, the location of scribal schools and scholarly traditions, how clay tablets were made. It also leads us to some conclusions about the right conservation protocols to preserve the tablets, because many of them are deteriorating after being taken from the desert to be it Torino, London, Paris, Berlin. So there are many issues with the conservation. We are now attempting to date tablets by archaeomagnetism, but that's an aspect that I'm not going to refer today. And it also opens some way for assessing the authenticity of tablets or bullae, seal impressions, and so on, that were suspected for being forgeries. Now, the study started with the methods that I can define as classical in archaeology for studying, for provenancing ceramics. And it all came out in this first book publication that referred directly to the Amarna archive. But in the meantime, it came out in 2004, and in the 15 years or more that elapsed ever since, we, of course, extended greatly the study to other archives and to other issues. But at the beginning, we used mainly two methods. First and foremost, petrography, and I'll explain in a moment. And also in collaboration with now is Emeritus Professor Hans Mommsen from the University of Bonn, he also did some limited neutron activation analysis study on part of the tablets. And so this was the first sources for our data, and I'd like to explain just in short about the methods. I'm not going to extend, of course, because it's beyond the scope of this presentation. Now, as we stand at the present, here we see El Amarna, but our study, naturally, we also looked for what we had under the hand, what we very optimistically call the Southern Levantine corpus, which means the rather few tablets that were found in the archaeological sites, such as Hatzor, Megiddo, Tanakh, and some Tel Gat, and Gezer, and so on, which all in all are just, we're talking about a few dozens of tablets. We did study for the comparison for the Alashia story. We did study most of the Cyprominoan tablets or texts that were found in Cyprus. Quite a bit of tablets now found in the Musée du Louvre from Ugarit, Ras Shamra, now in Syria, and some more than 100 tablets from the archive of the Hittite capital in Hattusha, Boazkei of today, together with some collections from Babylon and Uruk, but these are new projects that are still await their development. And so there is a bigger database now that allows us to look at the broader picture, because sometimes we have letters of both parties that took part in a certain correspondence. Now, just in short about the methods. Petrography, as you can see, it's not a high-tech, it's not a new method, it's a method that was introduced at the end of the 19th century by geologists. And the Petro, of course, tells you that it's a mineralogical method to identify rocks. But we apply it on, well, we can refer to it as to human-made rocks, namely pottery, plaster, and of course, stone tools and so on. And the idea is that we take a sample of the material. Today, of course, with the tablets, we need to take very small samples, and I'll talk about it again in a minute. I'll refer to the sampling and the problem of sampling. And it turns into a thin section that when examined under a polarizing microscope, which is a microscope equipped with polarizers and other filters, that in effect turn it into a sort of a visible light spectrometer that allows to identify crystals, not only minerals, but also other crystalline materials, by their crystalline properties. So the properties, what happens to light as it passes through them. And so by the end of the day, what we get here, we can see what it looks like under the polarizing microscope. By the end of the day, we can identify rock fragments, minerals, textures of even fine materials like clay, and also the human interference, because we can also identify changes and phases in crystals as a result of firing. And so petrography it's a very cost-effective method, because with a small sample, relatively, it gives you all these aspects of mineral composition, technological preferences or technological processes. To some limit, we can even, we can estimate temperatures of firing and so on, treatment by the artisans, whoever did what they did, as I said, firing, temperature, the geological context, because when the mineralogy and the lithology, the rock types within the material are very specific, we can ascribe them, we can attribute them to certain geological environment. Hence, it is leading us to the provenience of the materials. But the best thing about petrography is that once you take a sample, the thin sections exist forever. You know, they are like diamonds. They are forever. When I was once in Oxford, I looked at thin sections that were made by Henry Clifton Sorby in the middle of the 19th century, and they were as good as new. So for petrography, you only need to sample once, and then everybody can come and watch the same sample and sometimes get more conclusion from it. But together with that, as I said, we did NAA, neutron activation analysis, which is, again, a method that was introduced into archaeology in the late 1960s by Isidore Perlman of the University of Berkeley. And this is an elemental method. It examines the concentrations of elements, not minerals, but elements. And the idea is that every clay, every geological material, every earth rock forming material has its own composition, mainly in terms of the trace elements, the minor elements and the traces that appear in the material, that if you have a sufficient database, you can actually compare between the composition of an unknown, like here you can see sampling of a sherd. Yes, so you can examine the clay, find the composition, and everything that is yellow in this periodical chart is something that is an element that NAA can examine. And by running statistical packages, you can find matches and then assign a material to a location. So it is unrelated with petrography. This is mineralogy, this is chemistry. But when they work together, they become especially powerful just because of that. Because one method is sometimes helping to understand problems that we have with the other one. And now let us look at some examples. One problem that we were especially interested in was purely a technological problem. As I said, Egyptians were not accustomed to write on clay with cuneiform. They had to learn it. And when they became part of the, the club of the superpowers in the second millennium BC, even before, but mainly during the Middle and the New Kingdom, they had to adopt cuneiform script and technology. Now, in order to do that, we were interested to see how they adapted the technology. Of course, they had, I believe that scribes came into Egypt from other empires, other political entities, and taught Egyptian scribes how to do it. And as I say, together with that came also the literature and the language and so on, and the vocabularies and the dictionaries and all that we did examine. But on the other hand, they had, for example, to find a local type of clay that would be, in its properties, suitable for writing with cuneiform. Namely, not too sticky, not too dry, not too, not too gritty, and so on, in order to make quality tablets fit for the pharaoh. And so we wanted to see how did the Egyptians adapt this technology. And for that, we used different tablets, different sources, different documents. For example, this is a letter from El Amarna of Akhenaten, of Amenhotep IV, to the ruler, we even have his name, of Kadesh on the Orontes, a city-state in Syria. And the question, why did it exist in the Amarna archive? And by the way, this tablet was found during the excavations of Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie in the 1920s, and we examined it in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. You can see that the state of preservation is not good, and this is probably part of the story. But anyway, why did the Egyptians keep copies of their own letters within the archive is another question that we were interested in. Probably it could be as backup copies just to know what they sent, or it could be tablets that eventually they decided not to send, or tablets that came to the location and then came back to the archive. But anyway, this is supposed to be an Egyptian letter written on Egyptian clay. The other letter that we see here, it's not actually a letter of Ramses II. It's a letter from a prince in the court of Ramses II that was found in Hattusha, in Boğazköy, in Turkey. And this is a letter that was obviously sent to Hattusha, to the Hittites, from the Egyptian court. So these are just examples of letters that we examined. And we have actually letters coming from two different periods. One of them is from the Amarna period, and one of them is Ramesside. So there is a gap of time between the two. And the fact that we were mostly interested in was whether the letters were fired, because we know that letters from Babylonia, Mitanni, all this cuneiform culture, Ugarit, and so on, international letters that we examined were always fired. And the reason is that, as we can see here on a tablet from a letter from Hattusha, if you don't fire the tablets, then the clay, you can just wet the clay and make changes. For example, here you have a whole line that was erased and rewritten. And so to prevent this, letters had to be fired. But the question is whether the Egyptians knew this. And here we have two letters. Actually, this is the same letter that we saw before from to the king of Kadesh. And this is a letter from Ramses II to Hatti. And what we see here are the results of thermogravimetric analysis that we made to the clay. What these graphs show are phases. We reheat the clay, and so we can see the phases that the clay goes through. But if the clay was heated before in the past, it won't go through these phases, but it will just start reacting after it reaches the temperature that it was fired to in the past. And so we can see that here we have these two bulges. This is actually the sinterings, beginning of the sintering of the clay. So we can see that the Amarna period letter was unfired because it starts sintering at this level, whereas the Ramesside letter was quite highly fired, so it reacts only with the carbonate changes that occur above 750 degrees. And so it was fired quite well. And this is one difference. The other difference that we can see by the petrographic views that we have here, you can, even without understanding what we see, you can see that these are different. The Amarna letters were written on what is called today the Esna formation marl, or the Esna marl, which is a type of clay that was never used in Egypt for making pottery, but it is very white, it is very fine, and so they applied it for making tablets. In the Ramesside period, of course, they became more remote also from the exposures of the Esna marl, and so they used a different type of clay that is usually nicknamed the Marli clay, which is ancient Nile deposits coming from the Pleistocene, not the present Nile deposits, that are found, in the environments of Giza and into Upper Egypt. And the Egyptians used a lot this type of clay for making, for example, the amphorae that they made for wine and so on. And so we see a shift in the preferences. they used a special type of clay in the Amarna period, and then they shifted into a well-known type of clay in the Ramesside period, and they also started firing their letters, which was more or less in the line of the Mesopotamian habits. Now, sometimes when you examine, things that were never examined before, like city-state letters from the Levant, you may come across surprises that you never expected. And this happened to us with the study of the vast amount of letters from Byblos, the city of Byblos, Jbeil of today in Lebanon, that are found in the Amarna archive. Rib Adi, the king of Byblos, was the Canaanite ruler who wrote an enormous amount of letters to the Pharaoh, so much so that the Pharaoh sent him a letter telling him, stop writing to me, you write like, more than all the Canaanite rulers put together. And we know that because Rib Adi immediately answered him with 3 different letters, explaining why he needed to do it. But while we examined the clay of these letters, we saw many of the features that we see here with the arrow. And I know it from forensic studies that I was involved with, and also from the micromorphological studies of cave sediments and so on. This is, well, believe it or not, it's a fragment of a beetle. So in 5 actually of the Rib Adi, here we have 4 of them, of the Rib Adi, of the letters from Byblos, there were big fragments, big chunks of beetles, beetle juice. When I saw this, I came back to the Pergamon Museum in Berlin and looked under a sterile microscope at these tablets, and I was able to extract this leg of a beetle and bring it to an entomologist who identified it as this is a darkling beetle called Achis. It's very widespread all across the Levant, mainly, yes, also in Byblos. And what actually we see in the tablets are big fragments of these beetles. Again, they mixed beetles, which because it's quite a big beetle, they couldn't miss it. It wasn't something that was done unintentionally. And, the length of this is something like, 1 centimeter. So they couldn't have missed it when it was mixed in the clay. And so for some reason, whoever wrote the letters for Rib Adi in Byblos mixed beetles in the fabric, in the clay. Why would probably he, the scribe, do it? Well, we can only guess, we don't know, but because it appears in different tablets, it's not something accidental. It was probably done on purpose. So my interpretation was that, when we refer to Egypt, of course, beetles like the Scarabeus sucker, the scarab, had, of course, a meaning, and so, but scarabs, the actual beetle Scarabeus, is living mainly in sandy areas. It does not exist so much in the coastal parts of Lebanon, and so maybe it was some alternative to, I don't know, bewitch the king who is reading the letter. Of course, we can take off with all kinds of interesting stories, but again, this is something that we couldn't, notice before, and it brings some new information or some new aspects that we couldn't foresee. Now, another example is the story of Alashia, and because my time is running very short, I'll try to end quickly with that and only add to it some new aspects that we study today. Alashia is mentioned in several ancient Near Eastern texts. in El Amarna, but also in the letters from Ugarit. Here we can see one of several tablets from Ugarit, Ras Shamra, mentioning Alashia. There is a tablet from, or a fragment of a tablet in Hatusha. They appear, this name appears in the correspondence of the ancient Near East. And we do know that this was supposed to be a kingdom, because the king of Alashia, who never mentions his name in the Amarna tablets, identifies himself or refers to the Egyptian king as to my brother. And so he, at least he thought that he was equal to the Egyptian king. Another aspect or another fact is that Alashia must have been involved with the mining of copper, because all the letters from Alashia to the pharaoh in El Amarna, the pharaohs in Egypt, are referring to shipments, and one of them even to mining of copper. So it must have been a place where copper ores existed. And so for many years, since the late 19th century, it was commonly agreed that Alashia may be either part of Cyprus or all of it. But there were opponents, and still there are opponents to this idea. And so obviously it was interesting to check it. And in fact, a first study made in the early 70s by now Professor Emeritus Michal Artzi, a student of Isidore Perlman in Berkeley, on some of the Amarna, the Alashia letters from El Amarna by neutron activation analysis, indeed suggested that it may be in Cyprus, but it was not decisive enough. And so it was ignored for many years, this study. And we not only renewed it, we also let Professor Artzi add new insights to the NAA, and Professor Mommsen also re-edited or reanalyzed the old data to re-establish this conclusion. Now, places that were suggested as the location of Alashia were, as I said, Cyprus, but there are minority views suggesting either northwestern Syria, someplace in the Taurus Mountains or around the Amuk Valley, and or a place in Kilikia in the southern Mediterranean coast of Turkey. So these were the possibilities, and we came to this study with this idea in mind, just to compare, to see what the clay suggests. Now, coming to the clay, we examined not only the letters from El Amarna, but also this tablet from Hatusha, and this tablet that I showed in the picture before from Ugarit, from Ras Shamra. And the conclusions were quite indicative, because some of the letters were made of a clay that both chemically and mineralogically agreed with a type of marl, or the calcareous clay, that appears around the Troodos Mountains in Cyprus, and it's called the Pachna marl. Other tablets included rock fragments and minerals that were typical of an ophiolitic region. Ophiolite is the mid-ocean ridge that was lifted by geological forces into a terrestrial ridge. And the funny thing is that when we look at the map of the Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean, we have ophiolites in every location where Alashia was suggested. The Troodos Mountains in Cyprus, the Bir Basit Ridge in Syria, Kizildag, which is the beginning of the Taurus Mountains in southern Turkey, and the Mersin ophiolite in Kilikia. And so, of course, this was quite amusing and also amazing that we had this, but both because of the Pachna marl and because of the specific mineralogy of the tablets, we could suggest quite securely that the origin must have been in Cyprus and not elsewhere, because there are differences between these ophiolites when you come to the types of rocks and their exposures and the mineralogy in each one of them. In fact, in Cyprus, this is the geological map of the Troodos Mountains, we have a very well preserved ophiolite with basalts and with gabbros and with dolerites, all these rock types that were not preserved so well in the other ophiolites because of metamorphosis and other tectonic changes, and so it was much more suitable to be identified in parts of Cyprus. And another fact was that the Cyprominoan tablets from Enkomi and Kalavassos and other sites in Cyprus were of an identical composition. And so we are quite sure that this must be the location, not in Enkomi in eastern Cyprus as it was suggested, but probably in the area of a site called Alassa that was excavated since the 1980s. And notice that Alassa is quite similar to Alashia. Of course, this did not escape the attention of the excavators, in which there is, you can see, a huge palace. It's a very imposing, very impressive site. And so it could have been, of course, we can't be specific to the site, but it could have been such a palace or such a center in which the king of Alashia was settled. Now, today, speaking about, and with this I will end, speaking about new methodologies, new methods that we adopt, together with Professor Yaron Katsir, who is now is the head of the Institute of Earth Sciences in my university, in Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, who studies ophiolites in the in the Levant and the East Mediterranean. We are trying to extract one sort of mineral, and this is a mineral called epidote. Here we can see it in a close-up from this letter from Amarna EA37, and it appears here in huge quantities. Now, according to their study, the epidotes in the Troodos ophiolite are different in terms of their isotope composition from the epidotes in other locations that I mentioned. And so we try to prove also by this, or to see whether it does fit indeed the Troodos ophiolite. So this is a new study. It's still ongoing, but it shows you that we are, with the time, we are adapting new methods. And speaking of new methods, okay, here we see Erwin Finkel, who used to be, I think that he retired by now. He used to be the keeper of the ancient Near Eastern antiquities in the British Museum. And Finkel and his colleagues, curators, directors of museums, are, of course, becoming terrified when we come to them and we suggest to do invasive analysis of tablets. I could give a separate lecture about, invasive or destructive or non-destructive, and also show you that what people usually refer to as non-destructive testing methods is in fact highly destructive. So it's all in the eye of the observer, but still we try to minimize and to pinpoint or focus more our sampling after using non-destructive methods in order to examine briefly or to screen the composition of tablets and then select out of the clusters that we have, the groups of the materials, the ones that we would like to sample, naturally the more damaged ones that we can always break a small piece from an anyway broken facet and so on. So we started started it, well, less than 10 years ago, using this toy that now archaeologists are using quite vastly, the portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer or analyzer, or the PXRF as it is called. X-ray fluorescence is an elemental method. It examines the chemical composition of materials, and the portable instruments such as this little handgun are becoming more and more widespread and are becoming more and more sensitive. And so together again with Hans Mommsen, we tried to, when we already had results of tablets that we examined by NAA, by petrography and NAA, we wanted to know whether these instruments that has many benefits, but also many shortcomings in terms of calibration and accuracy, not so much precision, but accuracy and so on. We wanted to see whether we could get the same groups as we did get with NAA, and of course also with petrography, which was more widely used. And so we examined several hundreds of tablets, and we still do it now, so we can always compare. Now it's part of our ITN Marie Curie project, and we do it also with bullae, seal impressions from Jerusalem and from Crete and so on, in order to see, despite of all these problems that we have with surface analysis, like geometry, inhomogeneity and contamination, whether we could identify the groups, and the results were very promising. And here I come to the end. I just show this example. Here is one of our best study cases. These are two letters sent by the same person to the same, or written by the same person to the same personality. These are two letters written by Shuppiluliuma I, the king of Hatti, to Amenhotep IV, the king of Egypt in El Amarna. This letter was found in El Amarna, namely for more than 3,000 years. It was deposited in the desert, in the soils near the Nile, of the Nile Valley, whereas this letter was found in Hattusha. It's actually a draft of a letter written to Amenhotep IV, but it was probably never sent, and so it was found in the capital city of the sender. In not an arid zone, Hattusha is found in a semi-arid zone, or even less, and so the conditions were completely different in terms of what we call the post-depositional processes. So we studied both these tablets, both with petrography. Here you can see, I'm not going to explain about this, but this is actually this letter under the petrographic microscope, with what we call the Hattusha fabric, because it's a very typical fabric that we can easily identify. And we also examine this one. And coming to the results, so here we have well, that was published. That's the end of the analysis. The points that we got in terms of the composition ran by discriminant analysis, some statistical package that shows clustering of groups. So we can easily see that the tablets were clustered according to their origin. Mitanni and Babylon, for example, Babylonia can be distinguished. Ugarit is quite distinctive, and Hattusha is very distinctive. And this is in agreement with the analysis that we made with the other methods. Now, when we come to to simpler analysis, here we just compare two elements in an XY graph. So we can see that we still have these clusters, and within it, in the Hattusha cluster, we have together the two letters that we have, the one that was found in El Amarna and the draft from Hatti. They both cluster within the Hattusha cluster, and so indeed we can distinguish, and we can use this method in order to minimize the sampling for further analysis. Namely, it works, it does work, and this is what we do now as a procedure in every study that we do for sampling of cuneiform tablets. So I hope that I was able to show some, bits and pieces, some tastes of our project of study of cuneiform tablets from different archives in the ancient Near East. And of course, I have many colleagues to thank, and these are only part of them. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer questions if there are.
Thank you so much for this amazing lecture that has been a journey through the Near East, back and forth from Egypt to Cyprus, to see how much the material culture can tell us about the provenance, and as you showed us, also in clustering leather. I see that there are already some questions, but you triggered me one question that I cannot avoid to say, because of course I belong to this kind of people that are very cautious every time that invasive analysis are put forward. And what you showed us tonight, the case of Alasha was very important to see how much sometimes isotope analysis can be definitive or help in really understanding where a piece comes from. But you said non-invasive analysis sometimes are so much more invasive. So I should invite you for another lecture on invasive and non-invasive. But would you like to say something more on this?
Yes, of course. Let me give you just some examples. Well, first and foremost, when we take a sample, the quality of our analysis obviously is much higher in terms of precision and all that. But in terms of, from the point of view of a museum curator, conservator, of course, director, it is when you take a small sample and you do all your studies on it. And what we try to develop now is a protocol for extracting as many analyses as possible from one sample. Because when I take a sample, the sample for me is also an antiquity. It's an item. And so a part of the ethical question as to, who owns the sample. It's not becoming mine when I take it from your museum and go with it to my laboratory. It belongs to, like the tablet. It belongs, I believe, to the human, culture. So we must be very calculated in the analysis that we do, the set of analysis that we do to a sample. But that we do only to the sample. We still leave the entire object untouched. Now, to give you one example, which is quite extreme, and I'm sure that you know it, starting in, because cuneiform tablets were very sensitive to, climatic changes, because indeed many of them were just baked. If you take, I don't know, an archive from Iraq of today, and you bring it to London, to the humidity, the conditions of London, and in World War II, you even put it in the underground, because London has been bombarded, as well as Berlin and, all these places. So you need to preserve them. And so starting in the 1950s, tablets were fired in museums. And as far as I know, the British Museum fired some, tens of thousands of tablets until they made another examination, and they discovered that it was not necessary, because also fired tablets reacted with the environment. Sometimes it even increased the problem. And so with archaeomagnetism, of course, you erase everything that enables dating the tablet in modern methods. Also, because we are, like I showed, we are interested whether in technical details, technological details, such as whether tablets were fired in antiquity or not. When you fire the tablets today, you eliminate any test of this kind. On the other hand, if you use non-destructive methods such as, I don't know, scanning electron microscope, you can take a small tablet, put it in the scanning electron in an environmental scanning electron microscope and examine it. So on the face of it, this is non-destructive, but in the meantime, you exposed it to, high electromagnetic energy. And so again, any attempt to date the tablet is failed now. So sometimes we don't really know what these non-destructive methods actually do that will avoid and jeopardize researchers that will be with methods that will be invented in the future. So non-destructive is, is relative. It's not
Yes, yeah,
black and white.
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And it becomes even worse when you deal with organic material, when human remains, for instance. What does it mean to do a CT scan on and how does it affect the tissues and whatever?
Or even UV, plain UV is destroying DNA, which we examine today.
Yes, yes. And how much have we destroyed of DNA, by the way? We were part of a project with Professor Frank Rühli from Zurich, and we were taking samples of canopic material in the canopic jars and identified sometimes 25 DNA, of course, modern DNAs of all the curators in the past years.
Yes,
The
dandruff of the curator.
Yes, exactly. There are a few questions coming along. I'm going to read them from you. Have you ever used XPS technique for surface chemical physical analysis?
No, not yet, but I know that, people thought about it. It appears, this idea appears here and there in publications. One thing that we do intend to use, and we have it as a portable in our laboratory, is Raman, because there is at least one study that was published recently that shows that with Raman, they could see that tablets were sometimes even painted with pigments, which is something new to us, and it opens, of course, other possibilities, not just inscribed in ink like some of the Egyptian tablets, but also painted. But with XPS, no, not yet.
And then there is a question about firing of the tablets. You partly already talked about it. You have mentioned the question of firing the tablets. Do you take into consideration also potential secondary firing in museum collections? Have you considered to employ the archaeometric dating to identify the date of the firing?
No, in the case, the tablets that we examined were all, well, it was mainly in the British Museum and in the museum in Berlin, and they have the records. They with every tablet comes a card, and it tells us whether the tablet was fired or not. And moreover, in the case of Ugarit, for example, I examined a collection of tablets, including letters, scholarly texts, legal texts, and other administrative, vocabularies and so on, lexical text. And it showed, this study at least showed us that in Ugarit they fired intentionally only letters. They did not fire other documents, which makes sense, of course, but I wasn't aware of it. At least I didn't see this definition in the literature. So I believe that also in Amarna, the letters coming from Mesopotamia are systematically fired, whether the local Egyptian and also the scholarly texts are usually unfired.
And this is probably also because of the reason you told us, that it was to prevent that any kind of erasure, of course, that it could be palimpsest. There is another question. We saw many letters in cuneiform. What about Aramaic as diplomatic language? Not evidence from Tel el Amarna archives?
Aramaic? No, Aramaic well, I'm not a philologist, but Aramaic, as far as I know, is later. In this part of the world, it was Aramaic appeared after Phoenician, Paleo, Hebrew, whatever, Moabite, all these types of writing. Now, as I said, we do study what we call here bula. It's actually seal impressions, written in different languages, and they also, they tell a very interesting story about their technology, which in some cases helped us, mainly with the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, to identify forgeries that were published as very sensational bulai back in the 1980s in the literature, and they were actually made with different technology that does not agree with the normal technology that we find in bulai that were found in legal excavations, so recorded excavations.
There is another question. Dorota Cervik saying, interesting lecture, thank you. But I'm not so convinced about your interpretation on why the beetle legs were found in the clay. I understand you examined only some samples. Have you found any other organic insects fragments in the clay?
No, and this is what makes it. This is what drew my attention immediately. Well, of course, it's a matter of interpretation. I mean, I can only present what we see as facts, but a part of that, everything that I said is, my wild interpretation, which is not better than anybody else. But because it appears systematically in, more than one different letters by the same ruler of the same city-state, and not at random, I still think that it was intentionally made. Obviously, whoever made the tablet could not miss the fact that there are, parts of such beetles inside. But that is all that I can say. I can't say, the magic that I put into it is just my wild interpretation.
There are no more questions, but I want myself to go back to the firing issue concerning Amarna, because you just said that even in Amarna, the letters were fired and other documents were not.
Yes.
During the lectures, you showed us an example of two different tablets, one dating of the Amarna period, and where we could clearly see there was an erasure, and the other one dated at the Ramesside time, where you saw.
No, I'm sorry. The eraser that I showed is from a tablet from Hattusha. I just showed it as an example to what could have happened if letters were not fired. Somebody could use them as palimpsest, as you say, then rewrite on parts of them. So,
okay, when everything is clear. Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Well, then I would like to thank you for this amazing journey that you made us do through going into what we call the biography of the object, looking into the material culture and seeing how much it can tell us, and helping to solve philological and even geopolitical problems. And many questions are still there to be answered. But you showed us how important it is to have a multidisciplinary approach in order to solve questions that sometimes the texts just do not mention. So I would like to thank you so much for your lecture once again, and to thank all of those who have been connected with us to follow our lecture. And I would like to remind all of you that on the 16th of March, Paolo Marini will give a lecture on sarcophagi models from our museum, from the Museo Egizio. And he will talk about funerary tradition between Middle and New Kingdom. So thank you again. And
thank you very much.
To meet you in person here in Turin once the pandemic is over. Thank you.